in every election since. However, at this point, I would like to introduce my partner, Lelisa Williams, whose perspective and experience in elections is significantly broader than mine. She will also go on to introduce our moderator for the program. Lelisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, partner and co-chair of the President's Advisory Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm Lelisa Williams, Director of Faculty and Staff Development at Hudson County Community College and co-chair to PAC Day. It's so nice to see everyone come out for such an important topic. My experience with elections have 4 distinct dates that I can think about. 1920 as a woman, where women were given a right to vote in this country. Then 1965 is also important to me, at which time I was 9 years old, where women of color was given the right to vote. Then in 1994, when I went off to Fairleigh Dickinson University to study political science. And the last date that is real significant to my experience with voting and elections and politics is 2013, when I got the opportunity to cast a vote for myself when I ran for councilwoman for the township of Hillside, New Jersey. And so I guess you could surmise from all of that I am really, I'm more into politics and political science than I am per se to any one election. I studied American government, I studied governments around the world, and I just love the idea that people have an opportunity to lift their voices towards something that they believe and care deeply about. And I'm also a believer that people get to interact with other people that are different from them. So whether it's our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, our family members. So I just love it. And that's enough about me. And now let me introduce our moderator for today, which I'm so happy to do. I've been knowing this person for some years now, and I've always admired his background and what he also stands for. So without further ado, I want to introduce to some and present to others Mr. Tony Acevedo, who is an assistant professor of history and program coordinator. He teaches a variety, yes, nice round of applause. He is totally amazing. If you've ever seen him in the hallway or walking down Sixth Avenue or Eno's place, he is definitely someone for us to have a high regard for. But he teaches a variety of history courses, including Western civilization, honors seminars. Outside of Hudson County Community College, Tony has made academic presentations at venues throughout the United States, including the annual national conferences of the American Historical Association and the Community College Humanities Association. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And he has also been an NEH Summer Scholar in Switzerland and Italy, a Metro City Fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University, and recently he received the Dale P. Parnell Faculty Distinction Award, yes, from the American Association of Community Colleges. I present to you now Mr. Antonio Tony Acevedo. Tony, take it away.
Thank you so much, Louisa. You're very, very kind. I really appreciate those really nice words. That's really wonderful. I want to thank everyone involved in putting this presentation together. This is a great discussion at a really important time in our year and our pandemic, but also in our whole history, right? So I want to thank Natalia and Yuris and Amala and Kyle and Lalisa for putting discussions like these and this one in particular together. I will say the same group had me present on kind of the long view of voting rights a month or so ago. And it was kind of like this in-depth lecture that mentioned like the Greeks and the Romans and issues in American politics in the 1800s going to the present. So I was very much surprised when they asked me to moderate a discussion again, because I thought that I probably had given them enough at that point. But no, it's really a pleasure to be here. And to talk about the election that what is just less than 2 weeks old now at this point, right? And especially this year wasn't like we had an election day. It was more like an election week, kind of. We knew that we would have to have patience. It was kind of interesting, right? Because going into the election, we said we have to have patience because it's not going to be clear day one necessarily. But then I think so many of us, day one, were on Tuesday, we're like, okay, why is this taking so long? Why is this taking so long? And where do we go from here? And I saw a lot of pretty funny memes on social media about how Nevada was taking its time. So it's all kind of new territory for us, having an election during a global pandemic. But I think I've been really impressed with our national voter turnout and our national participation, which has been really incredible. When I teach history of Western Civ 1 and we talk about the emergence of the polis in ancient Greece, or when we talk about the Atlantic revolutions in Western Civ 2 of the late 17 and 1800s, we look at this idea of citizen participation and what does it mean to be a citizen. And we talk about this idea between being a citizen and being a subject. And I'll ask my students, what is the difference between being a citizen and being a subject, right? And these kind of questions spur really I guess, reflective and thoughtful discussion on the part of students. And then, some of them say, well, I guess a subject is when you are ruled by someone else, and a citizen is kind of when you rule yourself. And I'm like, well, how does that work in practice? And so, it could work out in many different forms. One of them is definitely through voting and through political participation. I can say, being the son of an immigrant, that I know that voting, not everybody has the right to vote, right? If you are here, for instance, with a green card, or you're here on a student visa or something else, right? You don't have the ability to vote in these elections. But luckily for those that do have that privilege, there was a lot of voter turnout this election, which was really impressive, kind of building off the last election as well. I will say that we have some issues in this country that kind of have made voter turnout historically low, right? So in this country, you have to, as you all know, you have to register to vote. Even it's not enough just to be a citizen and being of legal voting age. Not every country has this, right? We have voting on Tuesdays, which is, as I told the group last time, that whole why voting on Tuesdays, apparently this was because they wanted to give farmers enough time to get to polling stations and not miss church by having to leave too early on Sunday morning in the early period of American history, because polling stations would be kind of pretty far and spread out. So, but this seems pretty antiquated by now, right? Many other countries have voting on have made voting day, election day, a national holiday, or at least have it on the weekend. Some countries have even instituted compulsory voting, right? Such as, I believe, Australia and Mexico have compulsory voting, where you might be subject to a fine for not voting, something like under $20, but still, right? And so for a lot of different reasons, and of course we have a history of, sadly, a history of voter disenfranchisement in the country and voter suppression. So throughout our history, we haven't always had the highest turnout in elections. Sometimes it's actually fluctuated. Those of you who teach political science, like Professor Seidman, I'm sure know that at some points it's been higher, and then some points election turnout has been lower. But voter turnout in this country the last few decades has hovered between around 50 to 60%. This year's voter turnout is projected, as they're kind of bringing in the last votes, to finish around 67%. So that is a significant increase there. And I think it builds off of the high voter turnout of the 2018 midterm election. Midterm elections, as I'm sure some of you know, just like state and local races too, these kind of races that don't coincide with the presidential election have pretty low turnout. Normally, midterm elections are around the 40% range, between 40 and 50%, but the 2018 midterm elections were at 53.4%, right? So in the last couple of years, we've seen kind of like this improvement in our voter turnout, which has been encouraging. So even though we are a politically polarized and divided nation, really been encouraging to see the ways that popular interest in the political process has been heightened in recent years. As Yura said, you maybe saw a similar sense of heightened interest in some of these issues around the 2000 election. So at different points in our country's history, we've seen this. But people are tuning in to see appointment hearings of the Supreme Court, right, in pretty large numbers, or to see the appointment hearings for executive cabinet officials. It seems more people have shown an interest in understanding how constitutional processes such as impeachment or the Electoral College work. So these are kind of encouraging signs of political engagement. While the U.S. has lagged far behind other Western democracies in terms of voter participation, these trends seem positive. So I have just some general questions for you that the team had prepared, and I think they're a great way for us to kind of just kick off our discussion of the election and to share. And I will say also that I know whatever your political affiliations are, the election season has been one of pretty, considerable anxiety. I've talked to students as well who've just told me that they've been anxious, and I thought that just had to do with maybe the pandemic and their school schedule, but even the same, just the election and everything else is producing kind of a lot of angst, right? So I think discussions like these are a great way for us to just kind of like talk it out, share with each other, and kind of get our collective thoughts on some of these important issues. So one of the questions I have for you is this year's election will go down in history for many reasons, including the record-breaking voter participation, the first female vice president, and particularly as a result of the last midterm election, 2018, continuing to be the most diverse congressional membership the country has had. So considering these points, I'm wondering for all of you, what motivated you to participate in this year's elections? I'll open it up there.
Hi, this is Lisa Bogart. I voted because I always vote. I'm the third generation of my family to have held elected office as a Democrat in this state, and it's not that I always buy into the Democratic line completely, but particularly this year, I felt that it was so very important to vote. The issues facing our nation are grave and deep, and I think the pandemic has stripped back so much of the busyness rather that we have in our lives, so that these issues came out glaringly. We have a president currently who is rude, is uncivil to anybody, has tried time and time again to participate in voter repression. Then we go to the Black Lives Matter issues, and that we are still 50 plus years after Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement worked so hard to make advances in racial disparities. This pandemic again showed how much the racial disparities are still in place, not to mention the covert, really the covert racism that's very much apparent in our society as a whole. So, and again, this president's unwillingness to face the fact that we were in the middle of a pandemic and wanted to blame everybody and not take responsibility and not take a leadership role. I am so thankful that in this state, we do have a governor, whether you like him or not, that really has taken a very strong stance about trying to protect people. So that was.
Lisa, thank you so much. So that was a really gives us a great sense of, kind of like a multifaceted motivation for you to vote. On the one hand, you always vote, and you've had this participation in politics yourself, and it's kind of a given that you're going to be engaged in the political process. You have a really a great story there with having held elected office as well. But on the other hand, you kind of have this sense of urgency that this particular election was important because, as you said, you feel like the pandemic has kind of exposed long-term structural and cultural issues in the country's history. I think it's really valuable for us to hear. I'm wondering, I see some people are participating in the chat as well, which is great. Any others willing to share their thoughts on what might have motivated you particularly to vote this election?
Tony, this is Chris. I've always been fascinated by politics and thought for a long time before I chose a different path that was going to be my career. I remember, I say this for Kathy Seidman, when I was in 5th grade in 1968, my parents took me with them. My father took me with him inside the voting booth so that I could pull the lever for Hubert Humphrey. But this time, for the first time in my memory, I genuinely felt worried about our democracy, about our very democracy, the institutions that until now, I think I and many of us took for granted. And I still worry about those. But this year I felt a motivation to vote different from any other. The other thing I just want to share that this year put in perspective for me is, it caused me to view all of our other presidents and statesmen and women, but in the case of president, statesmen, in a different light. I thought when Ronald Reagan won in 1980, I thought the world was coming to an end. Now, when I look back on it, I may have had personal differences of opinion with certain folks that became elected, but they were all statesmen in the final analysis. Some of them, I think, made some bad mistakes, but they were all statesmen. I mean, to a presidency, as I think about it, you can probably correct me here, but we have never had to worry about the peaceful transfer of power and an understanding basically that the oath of office really fundamentally requires all of us to put country first. And I'm really concerned about the erosion of those very principles of our whole democracy. So I felt a motivation unlike ever before.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. I mean, that story about going at such an early age and being involved in the political process is really inspiring. I think it's, it gives us all a lot to think about. And I think a lot of people would share your concerns that about, there's been a lot of discussion the last several years about what it means to hold the office of the executive and what's expected with it, regardless of what your political affiliation is. And when it comes to something like the transition of power, like the GSA, recognizing the, president-elect and all these things, these are some, longstanding traditions that people are really growing concern over. Like, how are these going to work out going forward? Are some of the aberrations in these processes blips on a radar, or are they part of a new pattern, right? And I think what you also mentioned with being worried about some of like the structural issues in our democracy is, to what extent are those worries like at ease now, right? And to what extent are they not? Because, we all know that it was, of course, a major victory for in 2008 for the President Obama, because we hadn't had a African American or a executive that was a person of color at all up until that point. But we know that didn't make our racial challenges in the country necessarily go away, or this idea that we live in kind of a post-racial world, right? So we do have a new direction that we may be headed with the executive, but to what extent do people's worries or anxieties about the challenges to our democracy, are they going away? Are they not? Right? It's a lot for us to think about. Others, what motivated you to participate in this year's election?
Well, I also have voted pretty much, consistently since I was able to register to vote. In fact, Since I declared an actual party in 2008, I have voted in every possible election that I could, including primaries. So obviously this year was going to be no different. I felt a different sense of motivation behind voting. The moment I got my mail-in ballot, the next day, the next morning, I dropped it off in our local box, and I was very excited to do that. But this year, for me, it went beyond voting. I felt almost an obligation to try to do more things. I felt like I really had to go beyond just casting a vote. So for me, that meant volunteering to be a poll observer in Pennsylvania. Obviously, the concerns weren't for me and who I was voting for and who I supported. There weren't as many concerns here in New Jersey on that level. And as it bore out, there were concerns in Pennsylvania. So I really wanted to make sure that I was able to make sure that others who wanted to cast their vote and who felt motivated, regardless of their motivations, had that ability to cast that vote without intimidation and without blockage. So I if anything, this election has put in me a heightened awareness of almost an obligation to go beyond just casting a vote. That we have to work to create access, and I think Georgia is a great example of what can happen. When we put the resources behind dismantling structures that are there to block and prevent people from casting their vote.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I mean, you give us so much to think about there, particularly when you talk about being a poll watcher. I mean, that's a great way. You're anticipating even a question that I have for later in our discussion here, which is what are some ways to be politically engaged outside of just voting, right? And you're talking about being a volunteer. We can talk about other ways to do this later, but that's such a great example for us, right? There are, you also talk about like having this kind of sense of duty, like voting like every year, right? And I have to say, I have kind of like that same sense of urgency. My mother is not a citizen, so she's been a resident here, a legal resident for decades and decades, and she's applied for citizenship, and apparently her application has been lost. So I'm keep urging her to do it over and over. But she is one of the most politically minded people I know. But she's always like telling me to vote, like when you vote for this person or vote for this person. So I'm almost like, I want to vote for you, right? But I also want you to vote. So I keep like urging her to complete her citizenship process. But I see here that Mohammed has said in the chat, to him, he feels kind of like it's almost like I vote, therefore I am, right? I vote and I exist. Of course, I mentioned my mother, not everybody has the opportunity necessarily, but I really like that, what Mohammed is saying, like it's a way for you to, really establish your presence as a voter, as a citizen, and to have a voice. And Chris, your point about Georgia is really significant because we see there the controversy in the last gubernatorial election there, right? And issues about fairness in election and all this kind of stuff. And you see like a mass mobilization and a pouring in of resources into Georgia to mobilize the vote there. And you see a very surprising election result for many people, right? Maybe not surprising to everybody. We know that it was targeted, that even President Obama had been there just days before the end of the, up to the election day. So there was some effort there, and for the Biden-Harris campaign, it really paid dividends. Now, Georgia, of course, will be really important to keep an eye on going into January because of the Senate elections there, right? They, of course, if they swing to the Democrats' favor, could end up 50-50. And of course, we know that the vice president would have the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. So that would be really, really important. So You bring up a lot of important points there as well. I have another question here, which is this. We've heard some great aspects of what's motivating individuals to vote in every election, going back to their childhood or even in this most recent election. But I'm wondering here, what do you think might be some areas of opportunity or potential limitations for the new government, right? Now, we even said they're new government instead of just new administration, right? Because we did have, of course, some changes in the House of Representatives, some slight changes in the Senate as well. But we have a new government going forward as of January 20th, right? So what are some areas of potential opportunity that you see, or some areas of potential limitation? I'll just leave that open for you. Say Lisa says here a national pandemic response. Yeah, I'm wondering, Lisa, do you see that as an area of potential opportunity, or she's typing there? So I'll wait that response.
It's both a potential opportunity and it's definitely a double-edged sword. Because the pandemic hasn't had really, as we know, federally strong leadership. Every state has sort of been pitted against each other in order to decide what mandates need to be put in place, what executive orders, and how to just deal with the pandemic. And it's ended up politicizing wearing a mask, which has been proven again and again and again scientifically how important it is in helping to cut down exposure to this virus. So it's a double-edged sword, because we've already are 9 months into this pandemic, and we've had a very non-response for the most part. And now you're going to ask a government, and Joe Biden has indicated that he is going to have a national response to this. How are the states that have trended red and that deeply believe it with their leadership that masks are not necessary, or that this whole pandemic is a hoax, or people really aren't getting sick and dying? I mean, all this misinformation going around. So it's going to be a challenge to sell it to some people and to some states in this country. And I think other states, I think New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, which have been working together and share more common feelings and have been more responsive to our local government's way of dealing with it. He's going to have an easier sell, but it's not going to be easy. It's very hard to come into the middle of any kind of a big project or challenge and sort of turn things in a different direction. It's like taking an aircraft carrier and deciding that needs to change coordinates. Well, to move it at all, it's at least a mile before the ship can begin to start turning course. So.
Yeah, absolutely, Lisa. You mentioned kind of like this national leadership, right? If you mentioned these 9 months, it's hard to even think that it's been 9 months. It seems like the longest decade of my life, these 9 months. But if you recall, early on, we saw governors in their press conferences talking about having to bid against other states and the states bidding against each other, almost like on eBay or something like that. And it really brought me back to like the challenges of our very first government, which was the Articles of Confederation government before we had a constitution. Lasted less than 10 years, but you essentially had almost 13 independent states that just had kind of a general league of friendship, but otherwise were kind of really doing their own thing. And it just kind of gave me that sense. It's so important to have a unified kind of front on these issues. I'm wondering, for anyone else, if that was when you were thinking about areas of opportunity or potential implications, anyone else thinking about the pandemic?
I thought about the pandemic, Tony, but I also wanted to share with the group, at least my opinion, is that when it comes to the state or the instruments of government, I see them almost like an organic entity that changes. Everything that happens now sets a precedent for the future. And, when you look at history, very often we look at something that happened in the past that has no relationship to what is happening right now. But I feel that because of the pandemic, because of the last, the way that things have been playing out, a lot of important things have come into the fold. And by that, I'm talking about, the movement of Black Lives Matter, has brought like essentially race relations to the center of it. You have to think about the reemergence of nationalism and then nationalism. How are we as a people? And I feel that this particular election had a lot of identity politics associated with it. It was regional, it was racial, it was so many different aspects associated with it. So, going back to the first question that you voted, that you mentioned about why do you vote, that was kind of, I voted in every election since 2000, but that was kind of like the way that I was looking at, like whatever happens, these evolutions that are happening now are going to determine the future. And, the ones of us that have kids and grandkids, the legacy is what we're leaving them behind. And, I just don't think that we could have afford to stay in that, take a back seat to this situation. So, again, the organic evolution of the state, the relevance of history at this moment, and essentially what is going to be people's relations with the government. When you look at the statistics, the polls out there, how much do people trust or support the president? How much do they trust or support the Senate or the House of Representatives? Most of them were in the negatives, like most people kind of disapprove of it than approve. And now if you start asking about the Supreme Court, like the whole, it's been a political issue. And, it goes back to the organic evolution. What happens if people just lose faith in that and people just say, you know what, everybody voted this election, you're talking about 67%. But what if people say, oh, no, it doesn't matter. It's all, and that happens in a lot of developing countries, third world countries that, they might not engage it as much. And, the area of opportunities, I think it's for us to reassert our identity. We are an example to the world. We are the, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, the shining city on the hill, and I think that we need to reclaim that and we need to lead and we need to be an example for others. Those my 75 cents.
No, absolutely. Talking about these opportunities and potential limitations, and your kind of discussion of the organic state, right? I think it's really important for us to think about. We do, like some of these issues around public trust in the government, and you talk about the real dire consequences as a result of people becoming disengaged, right? This is really interesting because on the one hand, we talk about so little public trust in government, or you see so many accusations of, like falsehoods in the media and all this kind of stuff, and yet we're also seeing high voter turnout as well, which is interesting because it's not like a complete malaise or disillusionment with the government that's causing a complete retreat from politics. So it's a really interesting moment. Lisa's also mentioned, just the fact that the pandemic had become a political issue, not necessarily a public health issue, right? And I was thinking about this for myself, and I was, as I probably trying to curb or limit at least my intake of cable news, because at a certain point, I think it becomes like a little bit unhealthy, maybe. But you see the way that different news networks, present some of this information, and it made me think about the ways going forward that the populace will be informed and how that will shape our political relationships with one another. It's really interesting is I'm just finishing this book on the Constitutional Convention, which is really amazing. It's called Plain Honest Men by historian Richard Beeman. It was published about 10 years ago or so. And he makes the point that when the founders, who many of them had a real hesitation about excessive democracy, they called it, right? Of course, that's why we know that originally there's only direct election of the House of Representatives, not direct election still of the president, not direct election at the time of the Senate, right? So there's this worry about excessive democracy, they thought. they thought the good part of democracy was, voting is in the kind of hands of the people. But the dangerous part is the people could be easily dissuaded. They could fall prey to people who are good at winning elections, but not at governing, all this kind of stuff. I had often thought that the hesitation on the part of the founders with direct participation in democracy was because they had a general disdain for the intellectual faculties of the common people, right? That they didn't think that they were smart enough or all this kind of stuff. But reading Beeman's book, he really shows you how in some ways this was true, but how in many ways the founders were really worried that people just weren't informed enough. They couldn't be informed because of our limitations in communication technology at the time, our limitations in transportation technology at the time, that people weren't going to be informed to make solid decisions, right? I almost wondered the extent to which we're too informed now. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that too much information is bad at all, right? But there's sometimes we see misinformation, disinformation, and the way that you've all, I'm sure, quite sure with the way that we take in news that seems to just generally support what we already believe, and we kind of get like political tunnel vision, and it leads to kind of us versus them, and a lot of othering and stuff like this, right? So when some of you were talking about, Eurus mentioning issues of race, or at least with the pandemic, right? Some of these issues about the way that we receive information, all this have really got me thinking about some of these ideas as well. Let's see here. Does anyone else want to discuss the potential opportunities or limitations for the incoming government?
Tony, I'd like to just add that, in addition to, with regard to the pandemic, just really bringing us back to science and bringing science into the center of the discussion, which would have seemed until recently a no-brainer, but it's a huge item. But other things that I think we can really celebrate: reinstatement of DACA, that appears to be imminent, immigration reform, removing the barriers for Muslim countries to travel, investment in education, free college, and certainly healthcare reform, or at least hopefully moving back to more universal healthcare. But what really concerns me is the issue you're talking about, and that is, a number of years ago, I heard an interview of former Senator Robert Dole, who was a Republican leader, really an historic figure, presidential nominee. And he was asked, in all of your years of leading in government, what brought you the most satisfaction? And he said without a hesitation, it was when I could work across the aisle in order to really do the important work for the people. And he cited his work with former Senator Kennedy on the Americans with Disabilities Act. We have lost, I fear, the essence of what the two-party system had done for us for so long, which was bring different points of view and tensions into the discussion, but at the end of the day, compromise is what was so critical to doing important things. And now it's like compromise is a bad word, and we don't work together. And I worry that it's because of the proliferation of 24/7 social media. We aren't getting news. We're getting disinformation constantly, but we don't. I'm looking for journalists in the traditional sense of the word who really covered sharing factual information, not simply espousing a point of view. And so the final thing I just want to say is, while I'm happy about all of these pending positive things, and I really think community colleges are going to benefit in the new administration, somehow the bigger question for me is, how do we get back to a time when Democrats and Republicans work together and you don't have to have control of the Senate? My gosh, even if it's a 1 or a 2 person difference, there ought to be enough common thinking to get things done. But the only way we seem to get things done is if one party controls, a part of government. And I think education is the antidote. That's the final thing I want to say. I had said this in another meeting. I really think there are such strong correlations between individuals, and I don't mean this in an elitist way at all, but individuals that have gained, let's say, post-secondary credentials, and out of that have learned how to think critically and have learned to understand the importance of evidence. And I think there's a real difference between how folks that have an education have viewed the election and view the future, including conservatives and people that I might not agree with, but who are informed and who make decisions based on information. And those who don't have an educational background, I think, I'm not meaning to stereotype, but I think generally speaking, they're not valuing evidence. They're not valuing information. It's like the fake media. Anything that you don't agree with it doesn't have to be substantiated. It just is bad. And that's more than you needed from me.
No, that's really, you raised so many points that are kind of, really getting my mind going here. This issue of the claim evidence connection, right? When I went to the American Historical Association conference in January, I was at a really good panel on teaching in the history survey courses. And the panelists were talking a lot about, which we all do, about helping students ask questions, getting students to question things. And I think this is so important, right? It's a really important part of critical thinking. But I did stand up and say, I'm all for getting students to ask questions. That's what we should be doing. Students should ask questions about things that I'm saying, right? But I think we should also teach students to know what good answers look like and to know what solid information is compared to kind of like disinformation or misinformation, right? So that students don't fall into a trap where they will believe their questioning will lead them just to more questions that are there's never any direction towards answers and moving forward, right? So before the last several years, when I would say that I was a history professor, people would be, oh, that's cool, that's nice. But now the last several years, when I mentioned being a history professor, people are like, oh, wow, that's a really important job. Geez, yeah, that's so. One of the parts about that you mentioned, Chris, is the idea of empiricism, or the idea of having to, provide substantive arguments and support them with evidence. I just had a student write a great paper where the student made really good points from paragraph to paragraph that supported the thesis statement, but there weren't compelling examples in there. And I sat down with the student. I told him, you need to provide the reader with compelling historical examples that are rooted in historical fact and not in speculation, right? So you're making really important points, but then supporting them with really broad general discussions. So having a professor tell you, hey, you have to do this. You're right that it's not an elitism thing necessarily, but the aspect of education that calls you to come forth and to support your ideas and to maybe make them withstand rebuttals. And this, I think that's a really important part of education, right? And we see this not just in the humanities, but in STEM, any other disciplines where we're looking at the role of evidence in the classroom. I think it's really important. Yes, Patricia, I'll mention that book. I'll type the title of the book here in just a moment into the chat. It's a really riveting book that I'm just finishing up. It's basically just about the summer of 1787, where there was this kind of ragtag meeting to maybe revise the articles, and it turned into this whole new government that we have, of course, today. I'm having a few more questions here. What have you learned from this election season and the outcome? Right, it's a pretty broad question, which allows us to answer it in any number of ways. But some thoughts here. What do you think you really learned from this election season?
I think this goes into my personal interests, and I want to echo what Chris was saying. As a technologist, I see there's a lot of crossover between people being in bubbles, social media, disinformation, and information security. And how do you determine that someone's sending you a phishing email or a fraud email or things like that? It's critical thinking is critical to keeping us safe. But one thing that it just amazes me is how, when you look at the pattern of voting and the pattern of the results, how it seems like there really is like two different Americas, right? One, I would argue, seems to be based more on evidence of what's actually going on, like Lisa was saying about talking about actual statistics and facts, particularly when it comes to the pandemic. And I've talked to some of these folks, and you give them evidence, no matter what evidence you give them, it goes back in a circle like, well, but that's fake. Okay, well, what about this piece of evidence? Oh, well, the Democrats said that, so that's wrong. Sadly, I deal with this with my own father, who was a very scientifically curious person his whole life. I'm going to blame it on dementia. That's what I'm going to blame it on. But anyway, so it's just, we live in two different Americas. And like Chris, I'm very interested in, while I might have a different opinion, I'm very interested in moving forward on, okay, so how do you think of this and I think that, how do we come together in consensus? And I actually work with a group that's called Compassion in America. And we have 3 history professors that are involved in this group. And what we're trying to do is talk about how compromise is not a dirty word, and how, we the people, that means everybody, not just the people I like, need to come together and kind of stop with the us versus them. And I go back to, I think it was in the 80s, that in CNN, when they first got started, they had a program, what was that program called? Anyway, but you had 2 sides, and they would yell at each other for half an hour. I see Chris doing this. My dad loved that show. He was like, oh, this is so great. I'm learning all this stuff. I said, Dad, you're not learning anything. They're just yelling at each other, right? So it's to get the combat out of it. Yeah, we have an election and there's a winner. But I feel like the people are the losers because we get into this divided government, where divided government is okay when we compromise and go forward. And I do think, someone typed in the chat, I'm sorry, I lost who it was, that I do think Joe Biden is somebody that is willing and able to compromise, so I'm hopeful on that regard. But it's we live in 2 Americas. I'd like to see one purple America rather than this red, blue kind of thing, if as it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely, Patricia. I mean, this point about compromise not being a dirty word, I think is really important. We see a lot of political fragmentation, even with not just between, Republicans and Democrats, even within the different parties, right? You have different wings of the Democratic, party, and to what extent are they going to work in harmony and work together going forward? Or even in the Republican Party, right? You have almost like the president's wing of the Republican Party, which some people might argue has become the majority now. But then there's also accusations from that side against other Republicans who they call rhinos or Republicans in name only, right? So you see kind of this political fragmentation across the political spectrum, and we wonder to what extent will we see compromise going forward? Will the next few years, depending on the control of the Senate, be, like you said, this kind of crossfire, this kind of lucha libre, kind of professional wrestling as politics? Or will there be some kind of common ground that's arrived at to move forward collectively, right? I think those are really important questions to consider, especially as we head between now and the next midterm election in a couple of years. Others, just this general question of what you learned about this election season and the outcome.
One thing that was really interesting to me, and I guess, part of the pandemic, is all the things that we thought were impossible, or, that we can't do it. It's always been done this way. So the mail-in voting, the early voting. I saw that there were states where you could register to vote at the polling site, and all these things that I think we all thought, it's always been done like this, so it will never be able to be done otherwise. And how that really broke down the walls and the barriers to vote. So that was really exciting for me to see. And I'm really excited for the state of community colleges. I know we saw a big push within the Obama administration, possibly in part to Joe Biden. But, having Dr. Biden, somebody who still teaches at a community college and will still teach at a community college, is really amazing and phenomenal. So I'm really, really excited for what that's going to be for all of us.
Yeah. So Veronica, you mentioned this idea of like the new norm, like, these kind of modifications that we made for like voting and to encourage turnout. And I was worried going into the election, oh, wow, because of the pandemic, I sure hope people still vote, because it's really tricky, but people mobilized to really make sure that their voice was heard in so many different ways. And for all of our kind of challenges, and almost like maybe roll our eyes every time we talk about a new normal in terms of our day-to-day lives, everything from getting groceries to our 9-to-5 jobs or whatever, parts of the new normal might be like positive and might stay with us going forward, right? Like, I've actually even considered in my own teaching, like some of this, what I'm doing now, even when the pandemic's over, I might continue to do this because this is actually, I'm learning more about myself. The point you mentioned about Dr. Biden as well and being a community college faculty member, I think this is so important. So many times community colleges are like maybe more forgotten between K-12 and 4-year schools, or underfunded, and there's a lot of issues around our particular sector of the educational economy. And when you think that the sitting or the first lady elect is not just somebody who knows about community colleges, but an actual faculty member at Nova, like, right? It's like I've presented with people at Nova, like it helps at least give you a sense, again, not to make it too political here, but give you the sense of, okay, somebody will have an understanding for what happens at our types of institutions, right? Anyone else on what you learned in this election season?
I learned this election season, and I've voted for many elections, and I think my engagement prior to this election was kind of pretty passive. Like I would just vote when we had the presidential elections. But I think now I realized I don't have the privilege of being blissfully ignorant. Like I can't check out and just go to the polling stations and vote, because it feels like this time around feels like a matter of life or death to me. And like Iris mentioned earlier, like when you have children, or you have other people's children or people that you care about, that you think like, I'm handing over this world, I'm handing over this America to you, there feels like there's a responsibility to do something. Like I can't be passive. I have to do something. And I think just also it reminded me of how important it is to kind of like, that we do have some level of power, even when we feel powerless, even when we feel like maybe our voices aren't heard. We do have some level of power, and it's our responsibility to exercise that power, but to do it in a thoughtful and educated manner.
Yeah, I think I've spoken to others that had your same sense of urgency, Amala, right? That there have been several different elections where people have said this is the most important election of our lifetime, right? That's not necessarily a new term, but I think in this one, a lot of people, whatever your political affiliation, really felt that way, that there was a sense of urgency, that you couldn't sit on the sidelines if you could help it, right? So I think others would share your sense of that, right? We're at 11. I don't know how much more time we have. We do have a few more questions here for the group. What are your thoughts?
We do have some individuals that are jumping off, but if you have to run to another meeting, we understand. We acknowledge that time is very, very limited. We are doing so much, but if you want to keep on going for the next few minutes, we want to give an opportunity for those who still want to engage in the conversation, like maybe
Sure.
another 20 minutes or so.
Sure, absolutely. So a question for you here is, what direction do you see us going as a country? Again, these questions are fairly broad, but I think it's designed that way so that we have a chance to answer them in several different ways. So thoughts on that? What direction do you see us going now as a country?
I would have to say that I'm fearful for our country, and with all of this voter suppression and states allowing this to go on, and what Lindsey Graham apparently or allegedly did the other day by calling Georgia and trying to get votes thrown out, that's very frightening, especially to our democracy. And for a standing senator, head of the Judiciary Committee, to do something like that makes it even more frightening that he has no scruples at this point to do whatever he can. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, Kathy, I think that I would share the exact same kind of anxiety or fear. It's one thing when you see, these kind of ideas being promoted by non-government actors, but when you have the people who are supposed to safeguard, that particular issue, I think is, like you said, is an allegation, but it's coming from the Secretary of State of Georgia. And it's not that issue in particular, but just going back years, just the quest or the desire to limit the vote. We should do everything that we can to promote the vote, right? Especially since I mentioned we've lagged behind other countries. So any person, whether it's they're in government or not, want to suppress the vote in any way is really, really concerned. That concern just goes away with the.
And Tony, I wanted to add as well another level of area of concern for me specifically.
Presidential suppression.
Okay. No. Something that came up on Monday's meeting of yesterday's meeting at the barber shop was the division that we have in this country, how we're so polarized in different areas. And if you look at our history, right, when you look at our crises, our problems, you have to go back to the World War I, World War II, the Great Depression, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, 9/11. Whenever that happens, generally, the country comes together. There's this situation, we have our differences, but our differences are not greater than our common threats. We could bond together and move forward, whatever that is. And the concern that I have is that we're dealing with a historic pandemic. We are losing lives. We are, there's so many things going on, and instead of us kind of unifying or coming together towards a common theme or solution, the opposite is happening. We're more separated than ever before. And something that you mentioned in your introduction is that we had a really, the turnout in this election was historic. You never had this many people vote. And you had that for the winning candidate. But you also had the same for the losing candidate. So it's like the involvement and the level of engagement and participation is on both sides. So, as I mentioned earlier, that, the organic evolution of the state, things are never consistent. They're always changing one way or the other. I am hoping that there's a sense of realignment, that things kind of, go back to a level of stability and, that we're all in this together type of situation, rather than the continuous division. And, whenever we talk about the future and we speculate, we always have there's always the possibility that we might get it wrong. So, that's...
Right. No, Juris, I think this, when we talk about, you mentioned these examples going back in history, right? What's particularly challenging right now is, besides kind of the tragedy of the pandemic, we're working through major economic instability. And historically, when you combine political kind of chaos and economic instability, not a lot of good things follow. So Amala mentions, in the chat, hoping that we can go towards healing. Patricia mentioned before, the importance of compromise. So we're certainly hopeful that we can see some of this going forward. I think, Colin, you had your hand raised just a moment ago. It's nice to see you here too. Colin's a student in one of my classes.
Hey, what's going on? I have obviously not been in this meeting for very long. I kind of joined late to the party, but I noticed a lot of people are sort of talking about this general sense of healing a general sense of like coming together. I guess the point I really wanted to make was, I don't know how many people pay attention to local elections or necessarily money in politics, but in my view, that tends to be an issue that gets sidestepped for this idea of, oh, let's come together, let's do this, let's do that. And a lot of the issues in this country kind of just boil down to money. I mentioned a book in the chat called Republic Lost by Lawrence Lessig, and he goes through all the instances of money in politics. It's a very interesting book, and it really changed the way I thought about politics, really just at base. It changed everything I thought about it. It didn't really come, like at this point, it's like, yes, it's a two-party system, but you have to think that all the money in politics sort of binds them all together on this one scope where they're just inundated financially and they're beholden to all these interests. And so while the will of the people is definitely a thing they have to pay attention to, we vote these people in office. His point in this book is that you need to pay attention to local elections because these are the people that slowly elevate through the office. And if you voted for that person, you can pay attention to them more readily. You have these new names coming up in politics that you didn't really ever hear of. Like, I never heard of Senator Graham. And suddenly he becomes this guy that's just like inherently evil, seems like he's want to mess with Georgia, etc. And so I guess my point in all this is really like 72 million people voted for Donald Trump. The people that voted for him, maybe they're receiving disinformation. Maybe they legitimately want to vote for him. Maybe they're legitimately Republicans. But the fact of the matter, and my point really is like the money that is going towards these politicians that like are supporting his measures. Like that's what I'm more interested in.
Yeah, absolutely, Colin. And there are so many different like kind of I don't want to say loopholes necessarily, but there's obviously limits on what the individual can contribute, and then there are ways around this through super PACs, right? And then there's obviously being like the role of dark money in elections, right? And to what extent are people more beholden to powerful, machines, meaning like interest machines who are going to fund campaigns than as to their constituents? This is really important, especially when you look at the House of Representatives, which gets elected every 2 years, of course, how much time members of the House are spending on fundraising. It's really incredible, right?
Yeah, so, I think it's 80% of 70 to 80% of their time is spent fundraising. 20% is actually like dealing with legislation.
Right.
And that legislation is beholden to the 80% they just spent like generating.
Right, and that's the branch. That's the sector of our Congress that is responsible with revenue bills and everything else. So it's like so important, right? So these are like really important points you make, and this is something else that like that issue is gonna outlast one presidential term, right? Like that's something that we'll have to think about going forward. I just have one or maybe just one more question here for you. We'll try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. But what do you see as ways to be politically engaged in our country's kind of political process outside of an election season, right? Because we don't have another election for a couple years now, at least a national election, right? But like Colin mentioned, we should always be thinking about local politics. In some ways, people ignore local politics, even though local elections might have a greater impact on your day-to-day life than national elections, right? So what are some ways to stay politically engaged outside of an election season?
Hi, everyone. I would like to add in regards to some of the other questions, but also this one. I think the best way of, participating politically is just educating yourself, doing your due diligence. I learned something new this election because I had registered to vote years ago and moved a couple of times. I was unaware of the state regulations on how to vote. So I actually had to re-register X amount of days prior to election day, which I found out. So unfortunately, this election, I was unable to vote. Even if I cast my vote, it probably was going to be disregarded. I think the education is the most important thing, and getting people out there, sparking the interest on why it's important to vote. because for many years now I'm a non-traditional student, and I can honestly say that having taken U.S. history and American government, now I have an interest in something that pertains to me, but never appealed to me. And this election with COVID and everything and more people staying home, I think, politics are kind of more in your face than they were before. And maybe that's why a lot of people have turned out, plus the completely polar opposite personalities of the two candidates that we have. But I think, the professors are doing an excellent job. I commend you guys for, getting out there and educating everyone and, sparking that interest. But I think we need to open the dialogue and have these conversations, even if we don't see eye to eye, but just to find compromise.
Excellent, Tony. I'm glad that you were able to be on the have the lead on that issue with having to re-register too, as opposed to maybe if you just showed up on election day and you were given this bad news. So I'm glad you were really proactive, and that's really a kudos to you for figuring that out. That's wonderful. Lisa mentions here attending town council meetings, volunteering with town committees, joining local political clubs and organizations like the League of Women Voters. These are all great ideas as well, right? Look, you can also call, especially if you're voting, you can call your representatives, or you could send them emails. And if you're one of their constituents, they actually listen, right? I can think of a couple points in here. I live in Queens, where I really had called and emailed several times the state senator on an issue that was really important to local politics, actually regional politics, right? And I had major concerns about a certain type of development that was happening here in Queens. And there was and from what I understand, a lot of people doing this really put pressure on the state senator and others to really think about how his constituents were feeling about this issue, right? So you'll even often get replies. So I'm sure from an aide or something like that, but it's important to do that as well, right? Lisa also mentions having government representatives in a contact list and calling them. What I've done as well, I mentioned this last time the group had me speak, was I used to just go Google every individual person that represents me, from literally like local office to state assembly to national, whatever, right? And I would just make a list in my phone so that I always have it on me. But now there's these websites where you just go enter your address and it will spit out everybody at every level of government who represents you, right? And that's important to think about as well. So we're about at 11:15. I think we can probably wrap up there. I'll turn it back over to Eurus in a second, but I do want to just say how much I appreciate these kind of conversations. Natalia and Eurus and the whole group for asking me to come and kind of moderate this discussion. It's really incredible to be able to have these kind of important discussions with people who think hard about the world and the way it's working or not working, right? So I really appreciate you inviting me, and thanks for everyone for their participation. Eurus?
Thank you so much, Tony. Just briefly, I just wanted to share that when we're talking about, okay, who can we actually have here leading the discussion that has a strong foundation of how everything works and could kind of guide the conversation. And I think all of us just say, yeah, Tony. So Tony, I want to say on behalf of the group and for everyone and everyone who attended, I want to say thank you for leading this discussion. I mean, it was awesome. Thank you so much. And thank everyone for turning in. And, my own recommendation would be same as Tony. Find out who represents you. Find out who represents you. What are the roles? What is the stake? And, we just need to be engaged and involved as much as we can. So I know people are dropping off. We thank you so much for coming, and just be on the lookout. There's still more programming to come. Again, thank you